All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome to our 8th knowledge break in this series. I am Abby Stapleton. I'm a sustainability program coordinator here at Larimer County. This meeting is going to be recorded. You can pop questions into the Q&A. I believe that's at the bottom, or also into the chat. That works. We are going to go through some of the Q&A during the presentation if there are any that pop up. It can be conversational if that's how it goes. I'm also going to end the recording after the presentation. So if you would rather have your questions answered or you'd rather ask them off recording, you have the opportunity to do that towards the end. All right, you can go ahead and go to my first slide, Josh. All right, so I'm going to introduce Climate Smart Future Ready first so you know why we're having these knowledge breaks, and then I'll introduce our presenter for today. Climate Smart Future Ready is a community-wide sustainability plan that's coordinated by Larimer County. Next slide. And there's 4 main focus areas. So in Climate Smart Future Ready, there is the built environment, circular economy, which is waste, and then businesses and jobs. And then we have mobility of people, goods, and services. And the third focus area is natural environment, water, and ag, which is the focus area that we're in today when we're talking about disaster mitigation. And then we also have a connection between focus areas, and that includes things like health, policy, and land use. All right, next slide. And the county's approach is to zoom out and look beyond our government boundaries. So how is what Larimer County is doing affecting other areas in northern Colorado? And how are other areas affecting us? We want to collaborate regionally with this plan and discover best practices. This plan was launched last year in 2022, so we've been going a little over a year now, and we have 18 different action teams working on those focus areas that I just mentioned. This plan covers all 3 areas of sustainability, which is the environment, economy, and then the social pieces as well. And we know gaps exist, and by working together across municipalities and organizations, we can fill those. Next slide. So it is a very community-oriented plan. There's over 50 community partners involved in the initiative. Listed on the screen are the champions leading our teams along with Larimer County departments, and they're doing great work across 18 action teams. Next slide. And if you want to find out more information about the Climate Smart Future Ready initiative, then you can go ahead and go to this QR code. The slides for this piece, as well as the mitigation slides, will be shared and sent out afterward and also posted on our Larimer County website. That's all I have. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our presenter, Josh Roberts, so he can introduce himself. Take it away, Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Abby, for the introduction there, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and happy lunch. Hope you have some food and drink at the ready and ready for today's presentation. So today we're going to really talk about how proactive investments, aka mitigation, and community collaboration can reduce risk, save money, and build a stronger, more resilient future. I'll be talking about today disaster mitigation in general, not necessarily just looking at one particular hazard in our risk profile, such as wildfire or flood. Obviously, those hazards are at the top of our risk profile here in the beautiful place we call home, Larimer County. But for today's talk, it's really going to be more hazard agnostic and more just focused on disaster mitigation in general. So I'm Josh Roberts. I'm the mitigation coordinator for Larimer County out of the Office of Emergency Management. Excuse me. And I'm going to weave in today. We're going to weave in and out of the practical, theoretical, scientifical. I know that's not a word, but I said it anyway, and philosophical. So we're going to weave in and out of those things, and I welcome questions. I welcome some comment. I'm kind of an informal guy, so I welcome that. So either type your question in the Q&A feature there, or Abby, I know you'll be monitoring the virtual space here. So if somebody raises their hand, just feel free to stop me, interrupt me, and we'll address a question or comment that comes up. So we'll be together for about an hour or so, or less. So the first thing really to get started on this is I got to give you a good backdrop, right? And so, as I mentioned, I'm in the Office of Emergency Management. So the backdrop here is this thing that we call emergency management as a field of study and practice as an industry or a trade. What does emergency management mean, right? So on your slide, you'll see that in a government context, or even we'll narrow it down more specifically here to Larimer County, this is what emergency management means. Essentially, we are the office, the managerial function here within county government that's charged with creating and maintaining a framework within which our community reduces vulnerability to hazards and copes with disaster. Copes with disaster, it is really easy to say, but it means a lot of different things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But as you can see here, this is sort of a what emergency management is. This is a thread throughout, it's an industry standard throughout all those logos and their sort of best practices or models, that they might proffer to folks like myself. And of course, all of this is within a legal context as well. So as our county code of ordinances defines our office and what our responsibilities are, as state statute defines it, and as federal law defines it also. But speaking of this term, cope with disaster, easy to say, it means a lot. And theoretically, essentially in the textbook, this is what coping with disaster means. It's essentially providing those programs and services throughout all phases of what we call the disaster life cycle. 4 phases: mitigation, which is really more preventative side of things, just left of boom, right? Left of disaster, before disaster. Preparedness, well, before I talk about preparedness, mitigation, that's the phase we're going to talk about today, right? But that next phase, preparedness, again, left of boom, before disaster, that's more planning, training, exercising, equipping with the right resources to respond and recover, which are the 3rd and 4th phases. Response, immediate, just right a boom, handling the bad thing that's happened, right? Through those response systems and through our partners in the emergency services arena, utilities, community at large, all the things, the whole of community. And then that final phase, recovery, which is after the dust settles, piecing things back together, essentially. So in the Office of Emergency Management, we craft programs and services and do things that really sort of fit within that disaster life cycle. So you'll notice, though, that this is a really colorful, pretty simple graphic. Is disaster or coping with disaster that simple? Absolutely not, right? It's super complex. It's nonlinear. So this is truly an oversimplification of all the things that we have to do or that we have to deal with respect to coping with disaster. So if we understand what our charge is at the Office of Emergency Management, just as a backdrop here before we get into one of the phases of the disaster life cycle called the mitigation phase, it's also important, if not the most important thing, is to remember, well, why do we do what we do? And those are the 4 bullets on the screen right there that really sort of provide that foundation as to why we do what we do. It's to protect life, limb, and property, right? It's to minimize economic loss and property damage there. It's to protect the environment and our natural resources and sort of our way of life, right? That the community has come to know and love. And it's to, this act of recovery is not necessarily returning back to normal, because normal is part of the reason that you got into that business in the first place of the bad thing that disaster causes. But it's really to help achieve a state of existence in our community, the royal version definition of community, that makes it more resilient than what we were before the disaster. That's the why. So all of these programs and services and the things that we do in the Office of Emergency Management or any emergency management agency or the craft of emergency management, it's all got to help achieve that outcome, one of these outcomes. If we're not doing things that aren't in alignment and with that outcome, then it's probably somebody else's mission, not ours, and we shouldn't be doing it. But that's the why. Super important. Okay, so now mitigation. Well, let me talk about what I'll talk about here. So with respect to mitigation, that first phase of the disaster life cycle, if you will, I'll talk a little bit about what is mitigation, and we'll go through some definitions. I'll give you some facts and figures on why it's important and why it's worth it to do things like this. And then fundamentally, I'll tell you why we're all in it together and how we can all continue to be in it together. And that's what moves the needle in this thing that we call coping with disaster. Of course, sprinkled throughout. If you've got a question, think of it, tone it out on the chat, or raise your hand, and Abby will help me manage that there. So what is mitigation? Mitigation is this, it's a word like many other words that have different meanings, right? Or when you say mitigation to one person, they might have a slightly different understanding of what that means to them than it does to you. So semantics, I find, are always pretty important. So let's just talk about some of these keystone definitions of mitigation that we have that I work within here at Larimer County and here at the Office of Emergency Management and our programs and services. The first definition, and perhaps the most important because it's laid out legally in our Code of Ordinances, and I work for you, if you live and work and play in Larimer County, the taxpayers of Larimer County, and our the leadership, that's elected and appointed. But mitigation is defined in our Code of Ordinances legally as any activity that eliminates or reduces the probability of occurrence of disaster, right? Important. This is who I work for, Larimer County. State statute, state of Colorado, and in state law, defines mitigation as sustained action to reduce or eliminate risk to people and property from hazards and their effects. So already, even in our legal framework here in the state of Colorado, you notice a difference in the definition of the word mitigation, right? County, any activity, whether sustained or not. State, sustained action. Furthermore, our federal government and sort of the cornerstone hazard mitigation assistance and program and policy guides federal government puts out through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, their take on the definition of mitigation is really more geared towards natural hazards. And it sort of leaves out those hazards that might be man-made or technologically produced. So local, state, federal, even more in like legal frameworks, if you will, there's variance in this definition of this word that we call mitigation. Toss out a couple more definitions. So this top bullet there, that is taken from a book called Recasting Disaster Policy and Planning. I was formally educated at the University of North Texas. I have an emergency management degree. A key fact here is that it's actually the nation's very first degree granting institution in our field. It started in 1983. That book that I'm referencing there with this first book, my first sort of theoretical understanding of what is mitigation, it's pulled from that book. So this is what I was educated on. Again, more of a focus on natural hazards, right? And not necessarily technological or man-made. Another bullet, and Abby talked about our climate smart and future ready framework. If you talk to someone in Abby's world, for example, maybe in the climate adaptation world, the world of sustainability, mitigation a lot of times really just means reduction of greenhouse gases. And it kind of is targeted toward that definition there. Others, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and with respect to the National Environmental Policy Act, their definition of mitigation is really more through an environmental lens. And I'll point out too that it includes, you see this, if you read this last bullet here, avoiding adverse impacts, minimizing their effects, similarities, right, in our definitions, but it also calls out rectifying or repairing the affected environment. In our world, that's more the recovery phase, right? So all that to say, I think it's super important to note that there's a lot of different people and organizations through fields of study and practice and a lot of different industries all working on this thing that is called or adjacent to this thing we know as mitigation. And it's important, I think, sometimes to just call that out so that we're all sort of on the same page. And I'll tell you, in the 20 years that I've been doing this thing called emergency management, I kind of have, I've sliced and diced and spliced up those different definitions of mitigation into my own. And so I'll offer this to you guys. This is not any definition of mitigation you'll find in a textbook or in a legal document. It's just straight from yours truly, and it evolves. It's evolved throughout my career. So I don't know why it would stop now as I learn more and as I talk with others. But that is, to me, a thread that sort of combines all of those things together. What I'll offer is maybe what we could and should define mitigation as is advanced action, left of boom, that reduces unacceptable long-term disaster risk. Unacceptable meaning different communities and people and organizations have varying degrees of acceptability in terms of assumption of risk. Take, for example, every day we get in the road and we drive somewhere. We choose to put on our seatbelt or not. Yes, it's against the law if you don't, but that's a choice. And there are, believe it or not, people out there that may not put that seatbelt on. That is a level of risk that they're assuming in that choice. And so here I offer this term unacceptable because working together, we got to figure out to the community, to us. For example, here in our programs in Larimer County, the royal definition of Larimer County, what does unacceptable look like, right? The other piece of this definition I'll offer, long-term disaster risk. So we really want to try to cleanly and discreetly separate from preparedness activity, planning, training, exercise, equipping, etc., from mitigation activity. It's really more focused on the long-term risk reduction, not necessarily an immediate readiness measure. Further on in this definition, future demand for response and recovery to adverse impacts. So these are things that we want to do all for the purposes of decreasing those losses, decreasing those costs in response and recovery if something were to happen. So I might offer that my take on mitigation. But at the end of the day, it's the same difference. And I love this quote at the bottom right of your screen here. Same difference. It's just another saying, cool, whatever. It often get confuses with one another, but you're really saying they're not the same thing, but they're not really different enough for me to care about it. So when somebody says mitigation, depending on who you're talking to, they might have slight tweaks of a variance in that definition, but 100%, if we look hard enough and if we talk together long enough, there's a common thread that binds all of that stuff together. All right, so now let me get out of the definition and a semantics piece, and let's talk a little bit more about this thing that we call disaster risk. You'll see that defined on your screen there. Potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets which could occur to a system loosely defined, society or community in a specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. I told you I was going to get a little bit scientific on you here. But if you think about it here for a second, if we decrease the chance or likelihood of a hazard occurring, if we decrease our exposure to that hazard, how we're living, where we're living, how we're building, how we're constructing, etc. If we decrease that exposure, if we decrease our vulnerability to that hazard, inevitably wildfire is going to wildfire. It's going to happen again. It's going to rain. It's going to flood. But if we decrease our exposure, if we decrease our vulnerability to it, and further, if we increase our capacity to deal, if it does happen, then we are reducing our risk to that disaster. But we got to do all of it at the same time, all together. So, okay, you talked a little bit about, you got some theory in there, you got some science in there, you're spending some time talking semantics. It's a little bit dry, but let me now just show you some real world examples here, practically speaking, of mitigation. So if you look on your screen, on the left-hand side of your screen, if you're looking at it, you've got a home that's elevated. It's in the Florida Keys. I used to work in Southwest Florida, so we did a lot of this work down there. For every mile you went inland in Southwest Florida, you gain 1 foot in elevation. So at some point, that hurricane is going to cause a buildup of saltwater surge that's going to make its way onshore. So in order to decrease our exposure to that hazard that we know that's coming, let's elevate that home. On the right-hand side of your screen, I also worked in Texas for a little bit. That's the Trinity River levee system. And that city in the background there is the city of Dallas. Trinity River runs right through the middle of adjacent to downtown Dallas, big hospital district, and all those big buildings there. Trinity River can and will one day overtop the banks of that if it rains hard enough and all the things sort of conspire, naturally speaking, to make that happen. But they built that levee to kind of give that buffer, flood control wise, to have that happen. Those two things, elevating a structure, building a levee system for flood control purposes, those are mitigation activities. We are reducing risk, meaning reducing the chances of the likelihood of that hazard occurring. We're reducing our exposure to that hazard occurring, right? That's an example of mitigation. Let's try another one. Since we're in the West, let's go further west, out in California. On the left-hand side of your screen there, you'll see homes that are in danger of sloughing off the side of the earth there, in landslide danger, Southern California. So people live there. Do we want to provide them a program or opportunity to purchase their property, to acquire their property at a fair market value so they can go live somewhere else, right? That's what that picture is showing. On the right-hand side, that's a underground safe room in tornado country. So a place for people to go in the event a short fuse, low lead time event like a tornado is coming their way. Are those examples of mitigation? Absolutely. Remember, reducing the likelihood or chance of occurrence of that hazard, reducing our exposure to that hazard. We're moving people out of harm's way in the left-hand side example, and we're also providing an ability to get in a safer place than what their house might be in another example, reducing their exposure, right? Increasing capacity as well there too. More examples of mitigation. All right, let me toss these out there for you. On the left-hand side, City of Irving, it's a suburb there of Dallas. They acquired a mobile command vehicle for response teams and leadership of those teams to coordinate and collaborate on an incident response. On the right-hand side, Disaster City, also in College Station, Texas, out of Texas A&M, TEEX, Texas Engineering Extension Service. They have this big playground, for lack of a better word, where response crews and teams go to train, to do technical rescue training and all kinds of other trainings that are there. Are those examples of mitigation? Nope, they're not. Those are preparedness activities, not mitigation. So we want to kind of cleanly separate. On the one hand, it's acquisition of equipment on the left-hand side. And on the other hand, the right-hand side, it's training of personnel, exercising of personnel, not mitigation, preparedness. Still good things though, still great things. And we got to do those things, just not mitigation. Another example. This is a local example here. Larimer Conservation District did some forest restoration treatment. And the picture on the left shows the condition of the forest canopy before their treatment, their machine and hand thinning treatment. And then the picture on the right shows the condition of the forest canopy after their treatment. Is that mitigation? Absolutely. They're reducing the chance or likelihood of that hazard, in this case, high severity wildfire. Lots of nuance to this here, but they're removing those fuels to help decrease the chance of a high severity wildfire, given the right circumstance and conditions. It has co-benefits too. They're also improving forest health, improving the health of our watershed, improving ecological habitat for wildlife, putting more diversity of light on the ground, allowing for diverse plant species, which brings in diverse sets of wildlife as well. Co-benefits, also mitigation. Another local example, down in Boulder County, home hardening, creation of defensible space. Is that an example of mitigation? Absolutely. Decreasing that chance of an ember catching the structure on fire. Again, lots of nuance here, right? Lots of things go into the fact of, or go into the calculus of whether or not that home survived. But certainly part of that calculus, that formula there, is hardening of the home and creating that defensible space. And our partners and colleagues over at the Sheriff's Office have a program to help inform and educate, homeowners of these things to do as well. Another local example, just south of us, again in Boulder County. On the left-hand side, this just shows an area of drainage. So rains, high rate, heavy rains, water's got to roll downhill, right? It drains. That's what the drainage system in that given area looked like before their project. And on the right, that's what it looked like after the fact. Is that mitigation? You can see on the right, they're essentially providing for an increased capacity of that drainage, right? There's bigger funnels now for that floodwater to drain through. Co-benefit, they've got a cool little trail system now as well. Is that mitigation? Absolutely. A more local example here in Fort Collins, elevation of a road. You can see the Pooter right there. If that road had not been elevated, is that water going to overtop the road? Absolutely. So is that mitigation? Yep, sure is. Some other, maybe non-physical or structural means of mitigation, if you will, are comprehensive land use plan that helps to better define, with community input, of course, where we should be living and where we shouldn't, where we should be building and where we shouldn't, how we should be building and maybe how we shouldn't, within the context of our chance of seeing a hazard in those areas, and decreasing our exposure to those hazards. Now, adopting smart, wise, resilient codes or land use zoning measures, is that an example of mitigation to help move people away from risk, decrease our exposure, right? Absolutely, that's an example of mitigation. Same on the other hand, on the right-hand side, it's just a screenshot of a small grant program that we administer out of our Office of Emergency Management that provides a small amount of fund, up to $10,000, to neighborhoods or community groups to do mitigation activities. The mere fact that we have that grant program incentivizing and helping along reducing those barriers to mitigation work, is that mitigation? Of course it is. Why do we do mitigation and why it's worth it? So I'm not aware of any disaster sciences professional, whether they're in practice or in academia, that says disaster loss is decreasing. I'm not aware of a single one. If you guys are, I'd love to talk to them and look at the data they're looking at. But the simple fact is the frequency and intensity of disasters are increasing. Hazard occurrence, increasing. How bad those storms are, how severe those wildfires can be, increasing. Our exposure, more population, living in areas in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, living along the coast. Is that increasing? Absolutely. Vulnerability, our dependence on systems, the ability to lift that tap handle down the hill here and get clean drinking water, the ability to have electrification and power at our homes, empowering our devices. We are being more dependent on systems, so our vulnerability is increasing. I'll say capacity, our ability to deal with it, of course, it's also increasing well when you look back over time. But however, it's not at a commensurate rate of those other things that are increasing, like hazard occurrence and likelihood, exposure and vulnerability. We're not keeping up with the trajectory of those other things. And we got to break that cycle, y'all, because disaster losses are increasing, right? We're not making a dent. More is happening. We need to think about it smarter. We need to think smarter, not work harder here, but think smarter. How do we break this cycle? That's the purpose of mitigation. If you don't believe me, let's look at some data that others offer. This graph you can see from 1980 to 2024 here. It's pretty easy to notice the trend. Now, this is really focused on weather-related disasters and those disasters that exceed $1 billion. It's really the target of this graph here. But look at the data. You can see, and it's easy to see the trend in time. More losses, things that we can do to avoid those losses, though. We just got to do it. Here's some other folks, and rather than just looking at it through a United States context, let's look at it through a global context. And here's some studies and figures from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction on the things that are happening. Number of disasters in total, this most recent 20 years, roughly 2000 to 2019, are more than the previous 20 years. Deaths, same. Total affected population, same. Dollars in terms of losses or costs, they've gone up. Excuse me, I think I said same, but all of these are gone up is what I intended there to say. Here's just a snapshot globally speaking. And you can see in the US, While we're not the country with the most reported disasters, we're up there, right? We're up there. We like to be number one, but maybe not necessarily in this category. So here's more, if I can add. Think about disasters as disruptions, right? They're shocks to the system. They're disruptions of the functioning of our community and way of life or society. And they happen when hazardous events, natural, man-made, technological, interact with those conditions I was talking about, exposure, vulnerability, our capacity, all of those things. That is what a disaster is called. One of my I'm hesitant to say pet peeve, but it kind of is, if I'm honest, is I'll hear people use the term natural disaster. I get why it's used and I get where it's coming from. But in fact, what I'll offer you guys on this call is there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Certainly not in the case of natural hazards, meaning hazards like flooding, wildfire, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, avalanches, things like that. They occur naturally, whether or not people are here to witness them. It's a part of the our world and how it moves and how it's built in the ecosystem of all things. The disaster happens when that naturally occurring hazard, in this case, interacts with how we're building, where we're living, those kind of things. So, pop quiz to really drive home this point. What do you call a tornado when it moves through a downtown, a large rural open field? Think about it. What do you call that? It's called a tornado. It's not a trick question. Let me ask another question now. What do you call a tornado when it moves through a downtown populated area?
Disaster.
Disaster. That's right. So this is super important, y'all. Disasters are social constructs. Why is that important, you might ask? When you understand that disaster essentially are things that we as people in our systems, in our society, and our way of doing things are causing it, then that means we can uncause it. We have that ability. It's within our power to do so. We just have to do so. And we got to work together to do so. But no longer is a disaster, when you understand that, no longer is a disaster something that just happens. It's in the cards that were dealt. Not necessarily. They're policy decisions. They're decisions that we're making, how we're building, where we're living as people, as society. To me, that's super empowering because when you know that we can do something about it. A little bit more info on why mitigation is worth it. We talked about the why at the outset of this presentation, right? Mitigation and our goal, our outcome here, end of the day, kind of big picture, save lives, prevent injury, and protect our environment, both the natural and built environment, right? Mitigation does those things. I'll also offer to you guys, in addition to a moral or ethical sort of obligation as government, or as a public service to help save a life, protect that property, to do all those things, here's the key point. Mitigation is also saving money. At the end of the day, it's a sound financial investment that has a positive benefit cost. It's got a good ROI, y'all. Money that we spend on mitigation things now saves money down the road in response and recovery costs, down the road in losses that mitigation activity would have avoided. And this is not just me saying this. If you think about it for a second, it's going to make some common sense to you. It's also not just common sense. It's proven through empirically based evidence and peer-reviewed science. I can show you some figures, and I will. But the philosophical point I want to make here, sometimes we know it saves lives, we know it protects property, we know it does those things that's fundamental to governance and a government body governing, its citizenry. It also is smart financially, but if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it fall, does it make a sound, right? If we avoid impact of disaster by doing mitigation, how do we know that really, if that impact doesn't occur? That's sometimes where it may be difficult to really kind of just hammer home how and why mitigation is important. But I think you guys get it, and we can philosophically debate that age-old question there about the tree falling in the forest. You know, it happens. I kind of want to, let me stand by. I want to show you a few other summaries of papers, just a couple, where it talks about a positive ROI. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, and I'm going to share another one. I'll just run you through just a few, and there's more out there. One, National Institute of Building Sciences, they put together this 500 to 600 page report here that talks about a 6-to-1 ratio, meaning for every $1 you spend on mitigation, you end up saving 6 in future avoided cost. Now, there's some nuance, as with any good academic, research and paper here, but the nuance is how they come up with that figure. As you had some super smart folks take a look at FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance portfolio of grant programs, and there's 3 through time. Part of those grant programs, or at least a few of them, you have to provide what's called a benefit cost analysis in the application part of that proposal, or that getting that grant. And so these scientists, they had data. So they saw, hey, here's the value of this mitigation activity. So that return on investment, I've got to figure, here's the amount of dollars that were awarded through that grant. And they just compared the two, right? But it was across all hazard types, across the whole country. There's different risk profiles and different capacities across the whole country. So it's very much a generic talking point, but the principle is sound. It's got a positive ROI. When you drill down a little bit deeper into this 500-600 page light read document that the NIBS provided, federally funded mitigation activities in the wildland urban interface, we drill it down to wildfire specifically, they found that it yielded a 3-to-1 benefit in the reduction of wildfire risk. Still a positive ROI. Since we're here in Larimer County, and since we're talking about the wildfire hazard, let's dive a little bit deeper into that. There was a recent paper just from last year that came out in Ecological Economics Journal that really cited in high risk, high value watersheds, which we certainly have a few here in beautiful Larimer County, every $1 invested in forest restoration, which has a co-benefit of wildfire risk reduction, provides up to $7 in return in the form of benefits. I don't know about you guys, but that's a pretty solid ROI, right? Empirically based, peer-reviewed papers. Smart people are telling us this. Here's another one, another way to look at it. So there was a team of researchers that looked at some big wildfire disasters that occurred in California a number of years ago. And they looked at the amount of structures that were destroyed or damaged and those costs and the value of those structures, right? They had come up with, if especially things like work in the home ignition zone, home hardening, defensible space, if those things were done, then reasonably they estimated that they could have up to half almost, or a little bit more of those losses could have been avoided if those mitigation things would have been done. Another one specific to wildfire here in terms of fuel treatments. They ran some models, and I'll get to the brass tacks here. In the models they ran, in the simulations they ran, the mitigation activities in all those scenarios they were talking about, a positive ROI was found in every single one of the simulations. So it's not just a high benefit cost, but yeah, it happens. You spend money on mitigation, you save money and avoided losses. I think you guys get the point here. So I won't, there's plenty more papers, plenty more research that's been done that sort of proves this out. Let me get back to my slides here. Here's just another breakout of that National Institute of Building Sciences report by hazard type, and just also type of mitigation activity. It's just an easy look here. This is where that 6-to-1 ratio comes from. This is where that 3-to-1 ratio comes from with respect to things done in the wildland urban interface to reduce wildfire risk. So y'all, what I'll submit to you guys is we know mitigation saves lives. It protects from injury, protects our property, protects our environment. We also know that it saves money. So if it saves lives, protects from injury, it saves money. To me, it makes a lot of sense that we should probably do it and do it more, right? Also, though, I want to just sort of acknowledge that this concept of risk, it's not linear. And some of these data points and some of these things, that I'm talking about, I'm really distilling some very complex, nuanced concepts into just some talking points here. Risk is complex. It's nonlinear. It is not necessarily my fault, our fault, your fault, their fault. It's systemic causality here. It's our fault together, royally speaking, society-wide, community-wide, culture-wide. It's all of this together. And so if we're getting into this mess that we call risk together, it makes perfect sense that the only way out of that risk is the same way that it was created, and that's together. That's us all doing our parts, sharing in the stewardship of protecting our way of life and transmitting what we have to that next generation in a more resilient fashion. I think I saw a question come in the Q&A. Let me see if I can look at that real quick.
That was just
got
me,
it.
Josh. Yeah,
Yeah,
reminding
perfect.
folks that they can, interrupt or wait till the end if they would like.
Yep, totally. Thanks, Abby. So let me just give you some pictures of some recent mitigation activity that us and partners here in Larimer County are undertaking. So these are some pictures of a roadway fuel break treatment that our close partners at the Sheriff's Office and the Phantom Canyon Crew, the Emergency Services Unit, are helping us out with. They're doing some hand thinning treatments, getting some chainsaws out and reducing those fuels there along a really important evac route for some communities that area, as well as providing an opportunity for fire response, fire managers, given the right set of conditions, giving them a fuel break to protect what's east of that area, which is the entire community of Glacier View. Some good work happening right now, and I think they've just wrapped up that about 1.1 mile stretch of fuel treatment on the east side of the road there. This is another project that we're wrapping up at the moment. This is up in the Crystal Lakes community, about 9,000 feet in elevation, northern part of Larimer County, north of Red Feather. There's some machine treatments and some community-owned open spaces that have wrapped up. So that area of no trees there in the center of your screen, that was once a lodgepole stand. And so smart forestry for wildfire mitigation, risk reduction, forest health, all those other things are occurring in that area to reduce risk, among other co-benefits. Doing some patch cuts. They're doing some other cool things in other community-owned open spaces there too. Another example of a project, a mitigation project. This is a picture just following the containment of the Alexander Mountain Fire. But some partners at Northern Water were explaining how they did some hasty mitigation work to protect our drinking water, from that fire. So if you see in the middle of your screen, you can't see it, but there's a concrete conduit, if you will. That's the Hanson Feeder Canal. And you'll see up on the slope there on the hillside, some charred, burned areas. That's where the Alexander Mountain Fire burned to. And so the team there did some hasty mitigation things as the fire was occurring, just providing for a little fire break there and some containment of erosion in the soils and the silt after a rain, so that it wouldn't get into the water supply and cause water quality issues or mess up, the infrastructure there.
Hey Josh, quick
Yep.
question for you. Someone said the fire break you showed was made of timber, but I thought they were supposed to be made of non-combustible materials. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, let me see. What fire break are we
I
talking
think it
about?
might have been the stack of the logs.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Aaron, if you're talking about this right here, that's just a picture of, when you cut trees down, you got to do something with that wood that you cut, right? And so that's just a picture that depicts the crews there getting some chainsaws. they're cutting those trees down, but that's generating that woody biomass material that we got to do something with. And so they're just hand trucking it. They're just carrying it to the side of the road, bucking up those logs and the round logs there, and taking the tips and feathers of the trees and just stacking them up alongside the road. And what we'll do here in a handful of weeks or so, we're going to have a crew that goes out to get all that material and remove it from the landscape. So that's a good question. And, I'll offer this because you asked the question. If we are cutting trees down, right, to do wildfire mitigation, and we're leaving that wood that we cut down still on the landscape, well, we're not really removing that fuel, right? We're just manipulating it. So I won't say that it's not an effective treatment, because it is, but there's degrees of effectiveness, right? And so if we're leaving that wood on the landscape, then we're just essentially reducing the effectiveness of that treatment. Think about it. How do you get a campfire bigger? Well, you throw more fuel into it, right? One thing can also give it more oxygen flow on it or something too. But conceivably, more fuel that's there, then you're reducing the effectiveness of that treatment. But this is what that picture shows. They're cutting those trees down, removing that deadened down, and they're stacking it up along the roadside. And once they're wrapped up with that project, we'll get another crew in to remove that stuff and take it to an off-take spot. Great question. Here, actually, perfect segue. So these pictures right here, last year, Larimer County and its partners, they undertook a big year-long research project, if you will, to study woody biomass challenges that are existing in our county. So, meaning, and I'll sort of summarize everything. Right now, we have a rate limiter set on the amount of wildfire mitigation treatments we can do in a couple of different ways. But one of those ways is we run out of opportunities to do stuff with the wood. Our offtake markets, the tree species that we have. If you see that picture on the right there, that's a lodgepole stand. How big are those lodgepoles, diameter-wise? Pretty skinny, right? Tell me how many pieces of 2x4s can you get out of those trees? Also, I want you to think this particular picture where it was taken, it's up into the mountains, into the woods. So we're talking mountainous terrain, right? So if you think about that, that material can't get a whole ton of high value dimensional lumber or other products out of that wood. It's soft pines. These are not the deciduous hardwood forests of the Southeast. It's not the upper Midwest forest, right? So our material, it has, relative to those areas, more limited value. So in essence, often it doesn't pay its way out of the woods, which means on the market side, on the offtake side, we have a rate limiter, a ceiling that we hit, even if we wanted to do material, right? It costs to drive smaller trucks because you can't get bigger trucks into this mountain. It's mountains. It's not flat land, right? And so all of that goes into staff time, the fuel. It eats into profit margins. It eats into cost. And it is flirting with the fact of it's really not profitable in many cases. Again,
Josh, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you cut out on my end anyway.
Yep, same here,
over the
Josh.
course of that
You
project.
froze.
Uh-oh. Okay, stand by.
Yeah, just maybe re-say the last like 3 or 4 sentences.
Cool. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Get back to the slide. Last 3 or 4 sentences. The picture on the left was the part of the team that met frequently and got to be experts on this challenge that we have with woody biomass and utilization of our wood and turning it into products. So that's just a picture of us learning more from others. Next slide. Here's a cool picture. This is a joint project in the Cache La Poudre watershed with our partners at Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, Federal Forest Service, and others, many others that are part of this project. But if you look at this picture, on the left, you see the Poudre River, right? And you see those beaver dam analogs, or those simulated beaver structures, those log structures in the water. What that provides is it provides opportunity for the water to come downstream, to get dammed up, and then to sort of spread out. It provides for deposition of silt. If you look on the left there on that hill slope, it's Cameron Peak Fire. So if it rains on that, all of that silt, that ash, and that stuff that we don't want in our water system, it rolls downhill. Those log structures there help to stop it, provide sort of catcher's mitts along the way, if you will, that allows that water to also spread out in addition to catching that silt before it gets down into intakes. It allows that water to spread out, restoring that riparian environment right there. What's also really cool is this particular project was paired up with forestry pieces as well. So that buck and rail fence you see, that is wood. I mentioned our Woody Biomass Challenge. They took created those posts and poles. I don't know if they did it from this project or from another project, but they created that fence there as free range, open range territory up there to keep the wildlife essentially out, the grazing wildlife away from those simulated beaver structures. So cool project, lots of people involved doing some great work. Here's some other current examples of mitigation activities that we're undertaking. Right now, we have what's called a multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan, where we identify our hazards, we assess our vulnerability to those hazards, and then after understanding that, we come up with, well, here's kind of our priority mitigation actions over the next 5 years. We do that, and we put that in what's called a hazard mitigation plan. We're updating that plan right now. You see our last one, that date on it's May 2021, so it's time to update it. A paralleling but related project to our hazard mitigation plan update. You see the graphic there called Plan Integration for Resilient Scorecard. We are blessed in our area with a lot of different plans that folks in different industries and circles and groups have put together. Got a lot of them. But we're partnering with some friends and colleagues out of Texas A&M University System and the Hazard Risk and Recovery Center there, Center of Excellence in that institution. They've got this process that they call the Plan Integration for Resilient Scorecard, where they're looking at big important plans that we give them and seeing how those plans stack up with one another, how they're integrated. And certainly, most certainly, to call attention to where those plans might be in conflict with one another. I mentioned earlier, we want to be smarter about what we do. We want to work smarter, not harder, right? So these are current projects happening to help us achieve more mitigation. Y'all, I've